Makes a huge difference if you'll do me a favor by subscribing and liking the podcast wherever you listen. It goes a long way. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy. Dr. Ulcca Joshi Hansen is an educator, researcher, speaker, and facilitator, author of the book, The Future of Smart, podcast host by the same name, and parent. She has been nationally recognized for her work in education as a Harry S. Truman Scholar, a British Marshall Scholar, and a Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow. She is a futurist and thought leader on human-centered design and educational transformation. She has a doctorate in education from Oxford University and a law degree from Harvard University. She grew up in multiple countries and communities, which has greatly influenced how she views education and learning today. She tackles questions such as, how do we help human beings grow and learn so that they can build a better future? Why is this the moment for transforming education? And how can we cultivate a sense of belonging in our schools, leadership, activism, and workplaces? We have a wide-ranging conversation about education, learning, belonging, challenging the status quo, and the future. I hope you enjoy. I saw in your book, you have a quote from Sir Ken Robinson.
I do.
Did you meet him along the way?
Yeah, in fact, I worked with him early on in my career. So I was a teacher, and when I left the classroom, I went to work at a foundation in New Jersey called the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. So this was back in the late 90s, and we had an arts docket. And through our arts portfolio, we were working with the Getty Museum on learning in the arts. And so Sir Ken at the time was this little known, professor. I don't even know if he was Sir Ken at the time, but he was this, professor from Warwick University in the UK, and he came over and we did work with him. And so, yeah, I knew him early on. And I remember getting into conversations with him when I was thinking about going over to England to do my doctorate, because I agree with everything he says about creativity in the arts. And I also think that part of why the arts lend themselves so much to creativity and to a certain kind of thinking is because it's harder in the arts to forego process, right? Well, this may be different now with AI, but if I'm going to create something as an artist, I have to go through the process of creating it. If I'm learning to have a play, or if I'm drawing something or creating pottery, I can't forego the process of actually making it. And so process and outcome become really valuable. And so I remember having these conversations with him early on that actually you could think about science and mathematics and any discipline, when done at a really high level, also has this process element to it. And so in many ways, it's less about the art specifically and more about how do we teach certain things. And for me, that's a thread that's kind of gone on through the years. But yes, I was 24, 25
So it was last
when
year
I first
for
met.
you.
Yeah, exactly. My child is 18, and I'm just a couple of years older.
Yeah, exactly.
About to turn 24 in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, those mid-20s.
That's right.
What was he like? What was he like in conversations? Because I've only, read his books, seen his TED Talks, and
Yeah.
yeah. What was he like?
Well, and I'll say I also then worked with him. So I was hired to be chief strategy officer at a nonprofit that he and Ted Dintersmith had co-founded. And we were supposed to launch in March 2020. And then COVID hit. And then that's when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he passed away during COVID. And so, but I'd had a chance to work with him again, in the run up to as we were all thinking about, and the team was being hired. So, but I would say he is very much in private, similar to what you see on stage, a little bit more of a show on stage, but that sense of humor. I mean, that's kind of a British dry sense of humor thing where he's taken his life and his experiences and kind of mined them for really great insights to share with the rest of us. And, when you had a chance to work with him kind of one-on-one, because he did a lot of facilitation for groups and worked directly with schools, just, thoughtful, reflective, good questions that kind of made you think. And always kind of looking to create a space where people could come together, have a good time. Yeah, I think what you see is not all that different from what you get.
Yeah. When my daughter was going to be born, I read one of his books, and I think around that time, or when she was real young, watched his TED Talk about do schools kill creativity? And so that has definitely impacted the way I've thought about education, formal schooling, our daughter's education, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a really important point. I think he's spot on, right? And I think this critique, he is one of the people who made, I think, the critique of the factory model system the most accessible to a broad audience, right? I mean, there are many amazing people Diane Ravitch and others who've been writing about this for years. I just think his combination of examples and humor and then the making of that into the RSA animate that I think a lot of people have seen, right? It really kind of allowed that idea and that question to be spread in a really powerful way. I mean, his fingerprints and his legacy will be all over the work of transforming school as and when we finally get there. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and you're
at
doing
scale.
your part to make that happen.
You're trying.
So you talk about a sense of belonging and purpose in schools and
Hmm.
how important that is. So for people who haven't listened to your TED Talk yet or read your book, and we'll talk about those things, but why do you feel like that's so important? That sense of belonging and purpose in school education.
Well, the term I use for the kinds of schools that I believe in is human centered. And for me, human centered means things, whether it's schools or organizations or ways of operating, that are aligned with what we know about human development and what we know about how human beings learn and thrive. And for all of us, a sense of belonging and a sense that the things we are doing have meaning and are valued, right, in the world and by others, that is a foundational need. Without that, everything else kind of goes out of whack. In my first TED Talk, I kind of give this list of things, gangs and book clubs and fundamentalist extremists, and really say that belonging is at the heart of so many of these different spaces that people go to be seen and witnessed and known. So when it comes to our children, at this period between birth and 25, when young people finish adolescence, that is a unique moment in life, right? It is the place and the time in which human beings finish being kind of born and shaped into the people that they'll be in the world. And so if that isn't a time to center what is most foundational to them becoming human beings who have what they need to thrive, I'm not sure where else or when else you would do that.
Yeah, yeah. When I was in college, that makes me think. We had guest speakers, and this gentleman, the movie American History X is based on him. He came and spoke to our school. He, at that time, I don't know if he still is, was working for the Peace and Tolerance Institute
Mm-hmm.
in Los Angeles, but previously he was the head of the California neo-Nazi movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember him sharing. I was 20 years old at the time, so that was 4 years ago. Doing math, but just kidding. But a few decades ago, I remember him talking about how they would go into schools and hang out outside of schools and get that middle school age or end of elementary school, beginning of high school age. They would look for the kids that didn't have that group, and then they would be like, "Hey, come on, hang out with us. We'll protect you. We got your back." And I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Manipulating it for the wrong purpose, the wrong reason, but how important it is to feel a sense that you're attached to others.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that is a foundational human need. And, I mean, there are other answers we could give that we just know that when young people feel like they belong, they can feel safe. They can feel safe taking risks. They can feel safe, trying things that they haven't tried before. So that enables them to take chances and do hard work and fail sometimes and be okay. If you feel like you belong, same thing, right? That if you make mistakes, if you fall down, it's not going to be the end. That's deeply wired. So there's a functional reason and a pragmatic reason that we want this sense of belonging and purpose to exist. But at the end of the day, to me, the reason is that we need it as human beings. And education is about human beings, whether they're young learners or older learners. And so that's just super important.
Yeah,
And
and
my worry, sorry, I'll just add one thing.
no,
My
please.
worry is that these days, the word belonging now is being bantied around as people seek to avoid other language that is more, kind of divisive and polarizing. And so belonging has become the new term. And we can certainly talk about this because this is part of how I see the world. Words are interesting because they carry meanings and subtexts and context. And yet how we embody them in the world has a lot to do with mindset and how we sit in the work. And so there are some people, and we've all been there. You can think of an organization or a meeting or a place that you went to where the word, joyful, or you will belong here and you will feel, whatever. And you go there and you're like, nope. Don't really feel that at all. And then there are other places you go, and those words, whether they're used or not, you do feel that. And to me, that's a difference in how people are showing up in the work. And my worry right now is that, a lot of schools and organizations are slapping the word belonging and joy into their descriptions of what they do, but they're not actually building the capacity of the people inside those organizations to show up differently. And so they show up from day 1 to day 3 doing exactly the same stuff, but you just have a new word label, kind of slapped on top of it. And so, and that's not to make light, right, of the really hard work that our educators and our young people are doing and leaders are doing to make schools really great places. But it requires, to go back to Sir Ken and this idea of process, it takes time to kind of bring ourselves down into the work that we do in a separate way, in a different way, where we can show up in a way that really allows us to let people be who they are and really hold them and see them without trying to change them and fix them. And that's what belonging requires.
I love that because I've worked at places where there's beautiful words on the wall.
Yes. Yeah.
But it didn't feel so beautiful working there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's everybody's like, we're going to go through a strategy refresh and we're going to come up with a new set of words to talk about the work that we're doing. It's like, that is wonderful, but that is a very intellectual exercise that you just went through. And it's not clear that anybody is going to shift what they're doing just because but this is a very modern Western conception, is if we can just get the words right? If we can just describe it right, if we can just get the theory of change nicely delineated on a PowerPoint, somehow that's going to get us where we need to go. And I think that's just all something that's like a pattern of thinking that we need to disrupt and sort of get ourselves out of and say, actually, what changes things is when we move them from our heads into our bodies and can actually be and show up in the work differently for ourselves and other people. And that's a very different process than struggling over the right word.
Yeah, getting the right word on the paper or so how do we move the concepts then from our head to our heart, or our head to our body, as you say?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a small bottle of pills that you can take, and we'll get there.
Morning and night, or
that's right. Morning and night both. No, I mean, that
food or without
really depends where you're starting from, Chad. It depends how much of a disruption this is going to be to your system. I mean, this is the $20,000 question, right? In my book and in my work, there are things and frameworks, conceptual frameworks that you encounter that somehow can help you make sense of the world in a really important way. So there's a psychiatrist and neuroscientist in the UK named Ian McGilchrist who has been kind of the pioneer and the kind of drumbeat for this question. The human brain has 2 hemispheres. And while it is not true, right, this old idea of I'm right-brained, I'm artistic, I'm left-brained, I'm good at math, that is not true. Everything that we do, whether it's creative or analytic, requires all of our brain. And Ian asked the question and held on to it. Why is it that the human brain has 2 different hemispheres that are not exactly identical, where the corpus callosum sometimes connects them and sometimes inhibits one hemisphere while the other is more active? And the answer, through the research that he and others have done, is that human beings have to do 2 different things at the same time. So we are embodied beings. In this second, you and I are both taking in hundreds of data points, whether it's kind of temperature or small noises or the expression on your face. So the right hemisphere is like the large end of a funnel that allows us and allows our brain to be aware of and take in all of the richness and complexity that exists for us being embodied beings in time and space and place. And we can't possibly sort through all of that every time we have to use it. And so the work of the left hemisphere is this more narrow attention where it takes what's complicated and rich and simplifies it through this very reductive, linear, abstractive process. It creates categories, it gives definitions to categories, it kind of simplifies the world. So think of this as like the difference between the real world and a map. A map represents the real world, but it isn't the real world, and they're both important for different reasons, but they're not the same. And when the brain is working properly, properly, our right hemispheric capacities should be stronger than our left, because they need to mediate things, because things start in the right, they go to the left to be made simplified, and then go back to the right to be used in context, right? Some people might call that wisdom. And the answer to your question, right, in my mind, is we live in a world today that is very left hemispheric dominant, and there are historic and cultural reasons for that. That there was this period in Europe around 500 years ago when this metaphor for human beings of us as being part of a living whole and connected to everything was displaced by this idea of the world as a machine. And as a machine, you can take it apart, you can manipulate it, you can make it work, but it also puts us aside, like removes us from the world to be observers, and it lets us think that we can understand the world in this abstracted, conceptualized way that's kind of disembodied and fragmented. And that worldview, that approach to seeing the world was exported out of Europe through colonization. And so it is the dominant way of being in the world, and certainly in a place like America. And so all of us are very good at living in this conceptual world where we're like, let's just figure it out and figure out the right categories in the right world. And what we actually all need to do is develop our right hemispheric capabilities, which is those abilities that allow us to sit in and experience and feel and be in the world without trying to judge it or fix it, or sometimes even understand it or articulate it. I was just having lunch with a friend today, and we were talking about the fact that, sometimes she meditates and she bursts into tears. And somebody, what her teacher was telling her to don't worry about it. Just let it go. Don't stop. Don't think about it. You don't have to put words to it. Just let it be what it is. And I think that right hemispheric capability, right? It's when we can sit inside of that we are able to kind of let things move down from our heads into our hearts and our bodies so that they kind of show up differently in the world for other people and for ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. So it can go from our head to our heart to our hands.
Yeah, like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you traveled to other countries and cultures where you've experienced that firsthand?
Oh, yeah. So anybody who's been to Costa Rica, a lot of people, right, will talk about Costa Rica as a place where they go. And it's just, what is the word? God, perimenopause brain. I can't remember. But there's a phrase that is very true. And basically the phrase is just be in life. Right. And, but yes, and I think a lot of what we would think of as developing nations, developing countries, indigenous communities, right, hold on to these ways of being in ways that can kind of drive, your average American kind of Western person crazy. You're like, what is wrong with you? Why are you not in a rush to be efficient and get this done and that done? I mean, a lot of people have probably, who are listening to this have heard of the white supremacy culture framework of what, and if you think about the things on that list, I actually am not a fan of that framework. I think it oversimplifies something and puts race on top of it that actually shouldn't be. To my mind, it's not about race so much as it is about these two worldviews and this kind of left hemispheric way of being, this focus on efficiency and time and words and, that kind of stuff. And so I was just in Spain and I was in Japan. At one point I live in India. I talked about Costa Rica. We go to these places and everyone's just kind of life will happen. It's fine. It's fine. Sometimes it can be a little extreme, but right, there's this sense that life is long. Time is sort of a construct that we can live inside of, right? There is, in these places, you will have much more of a communitarian feel, right? That the relationships in community are sort of a place where we go. There is often a sense of abundance. And there's something interesting in that, right? A lot of left hemispheric thinking is very tied to scarcity because the left hemisphere, you can only imagine what you know, and the left hemisphere only knows what it knows. Right. And so it can't kind of dream or think outside of that. Whereas the right hemisphere is much more associated with abundance because you can see the whole, you can tap into the whole, you can be aware of what is there and sort of extend out into the kind of bigness that is reality. And if you think about, there's an area in philosophy called axiology that talks about how culture is shaped by place, right, and geography. And if you think about the southern hemisphere, you think about warm climates, right? If you don't have bananas, you will have mangoes. If you don't have mangoes, you will have other fruits or nuts or other things to eat. So this idea that there is enough is just kind of a part and parcel of how you live your life. As opposed to Northern Europe, where you imagine like this period when there was famine, you have 3 or 4 months to have the food that needs to last you for the entirety of the year. And so it matters that you have your own property and your own land, and that you have your own food, and that you know how much there is so no one's stealing it from you. And maybe even you want to get somebody else's food, right? Because it's your survival. And so there's that scarcity mindset that sort of goes in. So I think what I'm talking about, this kind of right hemisphere capability, is definitely tied into this notion of culture, and how cultures have organized themselves. And so if you think about some of the stuff I've just said, right, many people listening to this have probably been to places where they're like, right, that's there's something different there. And, you know, in the US, indigenous communities, if you think about the Inuit, if you think about the indigenous communities of North America, I mean, what's fascinating is that, you know, they had communities and tribes that even with cold and with scarcity, right, still had this communitarian ability to kind of say, yes, like there will be enough and we will take care of each other. So it's about worldview. And those indigenous communities were very deeply tied to, very intentionally tied to the wisdom of their ancestors that sort of carried forward before it was disrupted by Western colonization and the ideas that were brought, that idea of the world, right, and progress that was brought along with that.
It's a masterclass right there. Like, I want you to be my teacher. I don't know, dude, every week. Yeah, wow. It made me think my college roommate freshman year from Alicante, Spain, on the Mediterranean. And so right after freshman year, I went over, spent 2 weeks with him and his family. And his dad was working, but each day he came home like midday and he took a nap and for like 2 hours. And I was like, wait, what's going on? Like, aren't you working? Are you gonna get fired? And Jorge was like, no, that's the way this is here. And then we have our meal in the afternoon, and then he goes back for a couple hours, and then he's done. And I was like, whoa, like what?
Yeah.
You know, like whole different approach. Just like the other day, I was talking to somebody, and he's like, yeah, I haven't been sleeping well, but you know, it's a good thing I got my coffee in the afternoon to just keep me going, you know, and it's like a totally different approach we have here in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, some people, right, would look at Spain, for example, and say, look, that's an economy that is not as strong or as productive. It's not a country that's as wealthy as the US is. And by some definitions of modern capitalism, right, and sort of what matters, which in our country is sort of efficiency and markets and money, that may be true. On the other hand, right, joy of life, a sense of well-being, right, cultures and communities that feel intact, right? There are many countries that have that far more strongly than we do in the US. And so at a certain point, it's like, at what cost, right? In theory, you could make money until you kill humankind, but like, at what cost? So unrestrained capitalism is very much a byproduct of this modern Western worldview, this Cartesian Newtonian worldview, as opposed to social capitalism. Like, I'm not against capital. I think we should use money to do things, and people should be able to make money. That's all good. But at what cost, right? Do we lift up prices of our social media companies at the expense of our children's health and well-being? Or do we say like, yeah, you know what? There are some things we're not going to do. And I think these are questions that we're grappling with in the US right now, and with real consequences for our children and sort of society. And the Costa Rican phrase was pura vida. Yeah. Yeah. Menopause brain always gives it back to me. It's just not always at the moment that I need it.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Right. That's so true. Yeah. I mean, it makes, when I was a college athlete, we used to hang out I was on the tennis team, and we'd hang out with the swim team a lot. And, there's a girl from Brazil on the swim team that was like part of the friend group. And she's like that saying, the Costa Rican saying, she was just like, yeah, you know, it's all going to work out. Like, it's all cool. And I'd be like rushing around, like, I got to make it to gotta get there. Can't be late to this class or whatever. She's like, it's all good.
Right. And it's always a balance, right? I mean, we've got kids. I've got 2 teenagers. I'm like, no, walk with purpose, children. Walk with purpose. So it's the right hemispheric is a both and with, right?
Yeah.
There are times where we are into efficiency and time matters and all that. It's not that it doesn't. The left is very either or. So it's like always one thing and never the other. And it's like we could just stand to be a little bit more fluid, right?
Yes.
And when we have those right hemispheric muscles, we can go back and forth between the two. But when we're very anchored in the left, we are anchored in one way of being and we lose the other. So in many ways, this is the invitation to people, right, is to actually enrich ourselves because we can still have the best of some of these, the modern things that we have been anchored into. And also we can just sort of like release when we need to and be in a different space.
Yeah, yeah. So I've done some martial arts and
Hmm.
big fan of Eastern philosophy and like Bruce Lee was taught it was like water, because he would get actually when he was training when he was a kid, he'd get really angry and frustrated and he would make mistakes. And so, do you know the story about his
Mm-mm.
teacher? His teacher sent him out to, I think it was like a lake, and he had him punch the water.
Mm.
And he's like, okay, punch the water. And he's like, what happens to the water? He's like, nothing. And he's like, yeah, you need to learn to flow more like water does and be with it. Like mistakes are going to happen, expectations aren't going to be met. And how can you flow? I understand that you're going to get angry, but like, how can you continue to move on so you're not so stuck and
Yep.
locked up?
Yep.
And I think that's like, for me, like what a beautiful lesson that is.
Yeah. Well, and two parts to that, right? I think in the West, one of the things I've started to see is this like hyper positivity of
Yeah.
like, just be everything's fine. And I had a teacher who talked about 88 keys on a piano, and the most beautiful songs enable us to sort of have the high and the low notes. And so when you're angry, when you're sad, when you're grieving, when life throws something at you that feels unbearable, like we should feel it, right? That's part of the human experience. And the question is, how do we both feel it and experience it and acknowledge it and also be able to kind of move through it and know that it's not unlike water that you go back and forth, right? Flowing is not in just one direction. Like there's things that push us back, but it's the fluidity of that and the understanding that like we can acknowledge it. And sometimes in acknowledging it, I also have a martial arts background, so like what you're talking about, right? Like in acknowledging it, you actually give it less power and you give yourself more capacity to sort of move through it when you need to and to hold it when you need to, so it's not spilling out all over onto other people. But the more you try to kind of keep it at bay, right, the harder it is for you and the more likely it is that damage will be done either to you or to others.
Yeah, or both. What's your martial arts background?
It's Subakdo, which is the precursor to Taekwondo. So Subakdo is a bit more of the like original form, and then Taekwondo was sort of became more martial and became sort of more competitive, but that's the form that I think more people are aware of. But it's Korean, and it was based on this idea of fluidity and circles. So circular movements is a large part of it. But there were 8 key concepts, and 5 of them were mental, 3 of them were physical. Right. And so just even the idea that there were these 5 that had nothing to do with what you were doing with your body. It had to do with like the mental state you were in that then moved through your body. Right. That was it was a very deeply embodied lesson. Right. The good thing about martial arts is you're embodying a lot of these things. So
How did you get into it?
my brother's 5 years younger than I am, and he started doing martial arts before I did. And it was just this studio run by this female instructor. And I was like watching and thought I would try it. So I think I was what, 10 maybe or 9 when I started.
14, 15 years ago.
That's right. That's right. And did it for about, so I'm a black belt. So I did it for about 12 years, like consistently, and then have not really kept up with the practice. And my children had no interest in martial arts, and so didn't get to, but yeah, it was a very formative kind of experience.
Yeah, I bet, especially at that age.
Well, and on lots of levels, not just doing the martial arts, but also in the dojo, right? The idea that actually it was your rank that mattered in seniority. And so, you'd be 13 and leading a class full of adults in instruction because it didn't matter that you were 13 or 12. I mean, there were like 8-year-olds that would sometimes lead classes because they knew. And I think that also has shaped even how I think about education in schools, right? And most people don't admit this, but most of us don't think young people are capable, right? And so in general, we're kind of like, yeah, like hold them, mold them, put them into structures that kind of cabin them because they're not, they're not equipped to do things. And I think the experience of being in the dojo and having it be such an important part of my life, one of the lessons was actually it isn't about age. It's about, have you taken the time and put in the practice and the effort to earn your rank? And everyone then knows that you know, and then you learn from that person. And, what an egalitarian kind of space to be in for so many years.
Yeah, it's not based on, once you've done this period of time, you've done 1 year, you've done 2 years, now you get advanced.
Right.
Okay, yeah, you've been coming to this class for 5 years, so you get to lead the class. It's, okay, have you earned it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And shown what you could do, right? It's based on competency. You can't do it, you don't do it that time, and then you go back and you try again. But yes, exactly. Some people were able to move through ranks very quickly. Others, it took a little bit longer, and that was also okay, right? Think about the difference between what we're just talking about in school, right?
Yeah, it's night and day.
Right.
For most school experiences.
Yeah. And that's why this is why we know that young people prefer sports and arts and extracurricular activities and their camps, because in those places, they naturally organize themselves, right? Youth development spaces organize themselves in such that, you have to show what you can do. And different people are going to be different places. And for the most part, look, these are human institutions, right? But for the most part, that's so empowering. It's like, if I put in the work, I can do it. And that's why we know hands down that for most students, once they get into middle school and high school, you ask them the best part of their day, it's not the academic stuff. It's often their clubs, it's their activities, it's their social things, and they much prefer the things that they do outside of school to the things that we make them do inside of school.
Yeah, because, have you ever read, you probably know him, Dan Pink's Drive?
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's based off Desi and Ryan's work. And so it makes me think, when our daughter was little, she wanted to grab the bottle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a baby wants to grab the bottle, right? And they want to hold it. So they're searching for that autonomy, that control. Yep. And then as you go to the other end of life, like a frustration for people near the end of their life is the lack, that losing the grasp of autonomy.
Yeah.
So it speaks to our lifespan of how important that is to feel that sense of I'm empowered, I'm in charge, I'm in control, I get to be in the driver's seat.
Yep. Agency.
Agency.
Right? That sense of agency. Yeah.
Yeah.
Many of us are in this stage of having young children. Some of our children are older than not, but also having aging parents. And it is interesting if you think about the circle of life, right? You're born, you're kind of helpless and have to be taken care of, and you gradually develop more independence. And then you sort of get to this other stage of life where you are once again reliant on others, unable to do the things that you want. Right? So there's a real similarity, not to compare our elders to children, but in terms of the experience of life. And of course, the difference with our elders is that they have had the experience of being autonomous. And so they can actively miss something versus children who yearn for something that they're pretty sure it's out there, right? And they're sort of, their bodies and their brains and their sort of little selves are sort of pushing for that, but they can't miss it actively because they've never known it, not yet. So yeah, it's a, I don't know, for me, it brings empathy to conversations that can be frustrating, right? Around no, you can't drive anymore, or no, this is a really bad decision. And, at what point are we going to say that you can't, right? For those grappling with it, it is not easy days. And I wish there were more communities where, we could all talk about how it is that we best help people as they sort of age into the next chapters of life, right? Once they retire and still want to have, I've actually been really heartened to see the amount of activism there is now because of the demographic bulge of people who are of retirement age saying, yeah, but we know things, we have value. Yeah. Why are you shunting us aside, right? When you have nonprofits and community needs and all these things, we want to be purposeful, right? Again, this word comes up again. So it's nice to see that activism in that community, right? I hope it's a kind of shifting point for us in this culture of how we deal with.
With our elders. There's another cultural piece. I've spent time with people from many different countries, including traveling to other places. One of the things that I've drawn from, say, like the Asian culture that I love so much, and it's talking about Spanish culture before, is their their appreciation of their elders, the respect of the elders. It's like, okay, we need to glean lessons and wisdom, and we appreciate that time together. Whereas, like a lot of times in the US, it's like, okay, push them off to the side.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
there's a distance there and a disconnect.
yeah, yeah,
Like, like you talk about capable and competent, it's like, well, no, they're past their prime.
right,
You
right.
know, they're not capable and competent anymore. It's like we devalue like what they can bring to the table.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a delicate and interesting dance, right? I mean, no question, we all in the U.S. Um, have not figured this out in any way, shape, or form. But I remember talking. I was at a conference, um, and it was Asian American and Indigenous philanthropists, and there was a session I went to where there were the younger people, so 14, 15, 16, and then the elders in the community that had been working with them around this particular project. And there was an interesting part of the conversation where one of the elder gentlemen talked about, he said, the thing about it though is that yes, we are elders, but elders doesn't mean we get to tell the young people what to do or to boss them. He's like, because in many ways they have the vision and the ability to see what's possible because we've experienced things and sometimes forget what's possible. So he's like, our role is actually to guide and to share what we've learned, not because it's to close off what young people think is possible, but to kind of share with them the insights that we have from it. And I thought there's like a fine nuance there, right? Because often it can be, well, we're older and we know, and therefore what you're saying is wrong. And I appreciated the subtlety of his kind of naming that, yes, in these communities, because in this community there's that tension, and that just because you're older doesn't mean you get to dictate what the young do. And I think there are many cultures where young people might say there's like an over dictation by the elders as to what can be done, right? And sort of an over. So it's always about balance, right? These things, it's always about the balance. And that goes back to mindset, right? Do we see ourselves as part of a whole that is trying to like support the whole? Or is it about ego? And I am asserting my ego in this instance to kind of have power and to feel good about myself, regardless of how it feeds to the whole. And so that's kind of an ongoing thing. And this goes a lot to like systems and structures. Like there are reasons that there were rituals and that there were rites of passage at different stages, because rites of passage and certain cultural institutions or norms were ways of helping to codify and to have people share an understanding of what each phase or what things were supposed to be like in the relationship within the community. And I think one of the things we've seen just in the modern world generally, but especially in the US, is like the decline of institutions that used to be some of the places that helped weave together that social fabric, right? And some of the norms and the ways things were done and brought to people together across ages and life stages. And we didn't replace them with anything. And so we're sort of without any access to any of the cultural collective wisdom, when the irony is that the US should actually have the most amazing resources, because we pull from like so many cultures and countries, that we could have one of the richest banks of all of this if we chose to, rebuild that. So we'll see where we go.
Yeah, and to tap into that,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
I
yeah.
mean, because the richness is there. It's like the diamonds are in our backyard. We just need a shovel.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the curiosity to be like, oh, one, the awareness that the diamonds are there,
Yeah.
two, the curiosity to like, oh, we should like find out what that is. Yeah.
Yeah, taking it like to school standpoint, I was
Mm-hmm.
teaching at Springfield College in Western Mass like a decade ago, and I asked to observe this teacher who had been teaching for, I don't know, like 30 plus years, maybe close to 40 years. The students just loved. And why I'm bringing this up is because it speaks to like you're talking about that interplay of not dictating but providing a perspective. So he was teaching the class before me. So I said, is there any way I could come in and observe how you teach a class? Because I've heard wonderful things from students on campus. And he said, sure, but I'm not going to be up in the front of the room teaching the class. I'm using a flipped classroom this semester. So the students are up in front teaching lesson. I'm sitting back and I'm helping guide this along. And I was like, fantastic. And so I went and I remember it and I was like, whoa, why didn't I get this experience more like in K through 12 education or maybe at all? I don't even remember like, and I remember talking to him. I was like, that is cool because it was taking that authority, power, responsibility and putting it in the capable hands of the students and empowering them. So it wasn't about him. It wasn't about his ego, being the sage on the stage, so to speak.
Yep. Yeah.
It was amazing.
It does. It takes I'm so glad you had that experience, right? And it probably has shaped every experience you've had of teaching since, in terms of, in some way, shape, or form, whether you do it or not, is that question of where does the power sit? Are we learners together, or am I the, distributor of knowledge and they are recipients? Right? Again, the subtlety of that distinction, it matters. And it shows up, and we've all felt it. We all know when we're in the presence of somebody or in a place where you're like, no, literally, this is all of us together. Versus, I know my place. I know my place.
Yes. Yeah, and it's such a fun feeling. Like you talked about joy, when we started out a little while ago and some of these words that we grasp for, but it's like you can feel it. Like you can feel like when you're like part of something where people are rowing together.
Yes.
Or when you're on the raft or whatever, and like one person's rowing really hard, another person's hanging out, and like another person's preventing holding on to the oar. Like it's a feeling.
Yep, it is, and I love that you use that because I will often say like it feels a certain way. And I remember a lot of time in school or in college or graduate school, it was like, feel, that's not a thing. Tell me what was it? What was it? Put your finger on, I'm like, it was a feeling. And I'm not sure I can give you the exact words. I mean, I tried to write a book that gives some words, but it's a feeling, and the feeling matters. It's an important data point that we have all been taught to ignore because it's not good enough, right? I mean, think about, most of us have learned not to. Sometimes we feel uncomfortable in a situation, or we feel like, there's just something in our gut that's kind of like, and we've been taught not to listen to that because we're like, nope, got to think our way through this, gotta understand it. But the reality is that our brains and our sort of brain-based cognition is different than embodied cognition, which is a different kind of cognition. And our bodies, frankly, are smarter and often faster than our brains in processing things. There's some fascinating research that's been done with people like on trading floors, or people just even on like card games, where if you have a strong sense of interoception, which is this sense of what's happening in your body, like you can feel when your heartbeat goes up or your breathing changes or your blood pressure changes. If you're a person that's attuned to that and you understand how to listen to it, they did this card game on a computer where like 9 card decks, 5 were rigged to be good, 4 were rigged to be bad. And the people that had a strong sense of interoception could tell which the bad decks were, like 4 to 5 turns faster than the people who were just trying to logically like remember which deck. And it's because their bodies were taking in all of this information that their brains couldn't process fast, and that their bodies had reached the conclusion before. And they found similarly, like people on Wall Street trading floors, for example, it's really stressful. You've got to make like these huge decisions in a timely way. People with a strong sense of interoception do better and last longer in the field than people who don't, because they're maximizing both their brain and their bodies to think in the world. So feeling is a legit way of knowing.
Ooh, I love that. That's going to be like the quote for this podcast. Yeah, so true. Years ago, I was commuting to work and I listened to The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. Are you familiar with his work at all? So Gavin de Becker in Los Angeles do like surveillance, counterintelligence. His agency, his work, they work with like law enforcement, FBI and CIA and all those sorts of things, agencies. And this book was about the beauty of the gift of fear that we all have, and that, like you're saying, where people would have this feeling of danger. and they would be like, oh no, I've seen too many scary movies, or they would push that feeling away, but their body was telling them something doesn't fit, doesn't match up. That I got a bad feeling about this, right? And I could be getting this percentage wrong, but the 4 people are listening, they can look it up. It's like 80%. It's like 80% of the time that feeling was accurate. So um it's so, I think I loved it. You talked about attunement, when you were just talking. And I think it's something that we can tap into and we can tune like a piano or a musical instrument, and we can get it tuned like stronger and stronger over time if we pay attention to it. Because it's like, yeah, like I remember, for example, I had a job interview. It was on Zoom. And in the first minute, I was like, something's off here. And I was like, I don't, never met the person or anything, but I had a bad feeling. A bad feeling. It wasn't like, oh, I'm nervous about this job interview. It was just like this one individual who was the primary, like the lead of the committee. And I ended up getting the job and all that, and then going to meet the person, and I was like, yeah, that's crazy. Like, it was wild to me. Like, I could tell in the first 30 to 60 seconds, I was like, there's some sort of disconnect here.
Huh. And
there was.
What was it?
It was like
I mean, without revealing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
not gonna.
But you cannot tell us, Chad. Come on.
Well, I just was like, to me, it felt like the person was being fake. So I'm a person who's genuine, authentic, and to me, I felt like it felt just way too scripted. So I had this feeling that the person was like, because there were other people in the room with, as part of the committee, that they were putting on a front, that they didn't really feel like, it was one of two things. I felt like either that they didn't want to interview me, I didn't fit their mold, and someone was forcing them, or like whatever I was presenting, that they were just like, nah, I'm not, not buying this, but I have to say these things. Like, and so then when I met the person for the first time, I was like, yeah, I don't trust this person. Like, I don't feel like I even, how like if you've ever had this experience where you are meeting somebody for the first time, but you feel like you can trust them.
Mm-hmm.
Not like you would go, okay, I'm going to give you my kids or something like that, but
Right. Yeah.
Depends on how they're behaving, but
or how your kids. Yeah. I thought you met the person. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Your kids. But like, there's certain people that you get a vibe.
Yeah.
Right away.
Yeah.
Or environments like you're talking about.
Okay, so I'm so curious. So did you take the job?
I took the job, and that was, I love that you said you're so curious. It's good. You're using your curiosity. And the reason I took the job, everything told me not to take the job. Internally, but externally was like all these people are like, oh my gosh, like how could you not take the job? It's like such an amazing opportunity and everything. But I knew, I was like, something's not lining up. Like on the outside, it looks like, it sounds like it should be amazing, but I didn't feel it. I was like, no, I don't think it's gonna play out like that.
And were you right?
I was 100% right.
And were you right about the specific person, like that person specifically? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And, like hopefully lesson learned. Like I was just at this conference and there was this great session on failure and people were giving examples and they said, oftentimes failure is when we don't listen to our gut fast enough and we listen to our head for too long. And and I just thought that was such an interesting way because it reflected a lot of the stories where in retrospect, people would say something like you, which is like, I could feel it. It wasn't right, but my head kind of like, outvoted my body. And I think it's hard because we do want to caveat all of this, right? Most of us children are born with a sense of they're not unlike dogs, for example, and animals. Oftentimes kids will know, if there's somebody they don't want to be with or don't trust or whatever, and we educate them out of that. right? That we often were like, no, you have to, and there's a limit here, right? Like, yes, you can still be polite to someone in a safe space if that's a right. But we educate them out of like, don't ignore it if you're feeling sleepy, ignore it if you're not feeling hungry, if ignore it if, and so we're all educated out of listening to our bodies. So then the process of like learning to re-listen to our bodies and know that we're listening not to the bias of like, that's a Black man and my body's thinking it's fearful because I've been conditioned to, right? So it's a delicate, I think, complicated piece of work to reattune ourselves once we've lost that attunement, because by the time we're older, we have all these other layers of things that can sometimes be, kind of interrupting. And yet I think on the things that are most vital, right? And like if I'm ever alone by myself in a place, or I like feel I'm like, okay, like in this instance, I'm going to go with my gut. But it's a re-education of ourselves and an understanding that like we have to also then watch out for some of the things that might not be true. And I think there's a whole thing happening right now in the world where, because the world is changing so fast and it feels uncertain and it's very complex, right? We're all living in a VUCA world. This is the acronym: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And none of those 4 words is a word that the human brain is designed to like. The human brain is wired to want stability, predictability, kind of knowing, etc. So when we're living in a VUCA world, our like reptilian brain is primed to be in a constant state of high alert and stress. And so that makes it even more complex at a moment like this to be able to kind of down regulate back to a state where it's like, okay, yes, there's something stressful happening, but it's not an immediate danger to me, so that you can then kind of get back to, all right, so now what am I feeling? And so, but starting with the small things, right? The like, I meet somebody at a party and I'm just going to listen to my gut. Like, okay, I'm going to talk to you, and then maybe I'm just going to watch you for the rest of the evening and kind of see like what happens. But like start small, and then we're sort of more ready when the big things come around. Like, what does my gut say?
Yeah, is it because we've practiced it? Right? Like with the small, it's like makes me think of the gymnastics where they're like, okay, you start with this small movement, or martial arts, but like made me think of gymnastics before you're going off the pole vault.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
First day, hey,
Yeah.
all right,
Yeah. Yeah.
Simone Biles.
Build the skills. Build the skills. Yeah.
But you build up to it.
Yep. You build up to it.
And that creates that, a lot of times we talk about trust. And I think, like, when I talk about trust, a lot of times I think about in relation to others, but it's also in relation to ourselves.
Yep.
Right?
For
It's
sure.
like, how much do I trust how much myself?
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
And I think that's important, like helping young people develop that skill set, that awareness, education, understanding of like, all right, trusting myself. And like, even if others are saying, no, oh, you got to do this, or that, or you shouldn't do that. And it's like, well, finding that balance of them trusting themselves as well.
Yeah, for sure. No, trust of self is huge. It's why, again, when I think about this as right hemispheric muscles and strengthening them, you can strengthen them in different ways, right? This ability to kind of have your right hemisphere more active, to still your left hemisphere a while, to let it, and you can do that through things like breath work and through somatic like body scans, or through gratitude journals and gratitude practices, other kinds of exercises. So some of them have nothing to do with trusting yourself in the moment to make a decision about something, but it's all stuff that is building your capability to down regulate yourself out of your head back into a space of, okay, just being aware and just noticing. And then once you notice, then you can sort of interrupt the immediate process of judging and just hold off for a second. Like, does it actually make sense to make that judgment? Okay, yes. But you've given your gut a chance to like have it say, and then take that into account. And maybe at that moment, right, if you'd kind of like, you were literally interviewing for the job when you felt this. And so you were like, you couldn't listen to it that much, right? You're like, I'm trying to get this job. I'm getting this job. So it's, I love that story though. It's, yeah. You'll never make that mistake again. Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully not. I mean, I should have known in some respects, but like I came off the Zoom and I told the people I was with, family members, they said, how'd it go? And I said, like, I think I presented fine, but I have a bad feeling about it. I was like, the main person, there was a massive disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I don't trust that person. I said the other people, I felt like we were on the same page, but I was like, I'm going to have to be working with that main person. And I was like, and they're like, oh, well, maybe it's just on Zoom or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. And I was like, no, I'm telling you, there was something there. There was something in the air.
Yeah. And you still overrode that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ultimately to take the job.
Yeah, brilliance.
No, we all do it. We all do it, right? We could all of us, I'm sure, make a nice long list of the
Mm-hmm.
experiences we've had where we're like, in retrospect, we're like, yeah, I didn't feel it. It's really interesting if you journal, like if you're somebody who journals,
Yeah.
that because then you have a real time record as opposed to like the post, kind of analysis bias. So if you're a person who journals and goes back to like, the moments or period and you're like, oh man, look at that. Like it was there. I said it to myself, or I said something that like next time I want to make sure to listen to that because look what happened. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was like Mel Robbins, who's now like huge in the podcast world
Yeah.
in the US. Like, I think she said it. It was somebody like that who said attention, like with in all types of relationships and with the energy. Like, do I feel like I'm charged when I'm interacting with this person, or do I feel like I'm being drained?
Mm.
And she's like, and whether it's a job or anything of that shape, she's like, I want to move more and more towards the people that charge me like an elevator, that take me up to the top floor versus
Mm-hmm.
take me down to the basement.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's interesting. And I think that's mostly true for most of us. I think what's interesting is if we're in any kind of work, whether it's being an educator of young people or being a facilitator of adults and adult learning, or if we're trying to do work in the world that requires bringing people along, the challenge then becomes if we only work with those people or if we disproportionately push those people to the side, how do we actually get to the point where we bridge into relationships with them that allow us to kind of move them along in many cases because they're necessary? And there's in sort of conflict resolution, there's this idea of breaking, right, where fear and mistrust break relationships. There's bridging, which is can we expand our circle, like our inner circle or like the circle of relatedness to include more people so that we can bridge. So even if we believe slightly different things or have slightly different experiences, we can still find ways to bond. And then there's bridging. Bridging is when you literally, and not everybody does this work, but it's the people who will put themselves into the spaces where they might be with people who would bring them down energetically or in other ways. But I think knowing a lot of people like that and being more of a bridger in many circumstances myself, I think there is a skill you learn, which is how do you actually, I won't say take an anthropological lens, but it's how are you in the interaction and sitting slightly on the side of it as well to kind of remember that their energy doesn't have to shape your energy or doesn't have to affect it. Like it, yes, you're people and you're in the same space, but you don't have to take on what that other person has. But that's a different skill than most of us walk around with every day in the world. And I think it's actually something that in these times of polarization and dividedness, there's probably elements of that bridging skill that more and more of us need to learn and build, because it can feel very hard with social media and polarized debates that have trained our brains to immediately put people into boxes based on social cues or social signals, to be able to kind of disrupt that a little bit and say, all right, we can kind of still be here, still kind of sit and hear each other to the extent that we can bring it. Thanksgiving being the prime example for most people, right?
Yeah.
It's like, how are you with your family? Right.
Yes.
Today, everybody's family. I feel like, I mean, maybe there's exceptions, but like I don't hear of many. Everybody's got somebody, right, in their family that is that person. And there's a lot of talk about just I'm cutting my family off, or I'm, canceling this person, or I'm whatever. I'm like, that feels like we're maybe taking it a little bit too far. And maybe we haven't quite, thought through the responsibility that and the not just the responsibility, but the capacity each of us has.
Yeah. It's
To
like
be
a
okay.
dial.
It is a dial.
And just because I disagree with you on something doesn't mean that we don't agree on other things or that we don't have a shared value.
Yeah. 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 And to the, where you started, where you said that there was this guy who came who had been involved with the neo-Nazis and was telling you that story about where they went. Like in many ways, like there are many people who end up going over into ideologies or groups that actually went over for reasons that had very little to do with the idea itself and more to do with this feeling of like, I have a group, I have a tribe, I have a space where there are others around me. And I think in the world, the way it is right now, there are a lot of people who have felt excluded and felt like they don't know their place. My sort of analogy of the US right now is that we're like in middle school. So middle school, part of the reason developmentally it's such a hard time is because you're moving away from your family as being your source of your primary identity to sort of going out into the world with your peers and other adults, etc. And it's terrifying because you don't know. It's important that you fit in. It's important that you have a space and a place because your survival literally kind of depends on it. And so that's why you often have kind of cliques and in groups and out groups and bullying, because when you're not feeling safe, the inclination is to go in and attack anything that feels threatening. And in some ways, like as a country over the last kind of 20 years, 25 years, there's been this push against a dominant narrative that many people in this country have held as theirs and have seen themselves inside of. And there's been this pushback against it that has psychologically, I think, left many people feeling like, wait, so you're telling me this isn't my country, or that if you have your way, there won't be a place for me. And I think, for lots of reasons, there are people who invested in media and other kind of places and spaces and fora to draw people in who were feeling that and have sort of radicalize them, right, in kind of very real ways. So we're at a point in America where I think it's a question of like, can we actually find a narrative and find a sense of like who we are and a story about who we are that gives people the capacity to kind of see themselves, and for individuals to rebuild the capacity to kind of be like, actually, to belong is a two-way street, and that I can still belong in a story that's more rich and complicated than the one that I inherited in all sorts of ways, right? I think this is true of people across race and cultural and political stripes. But I feel like that's where we are as a country. And sort of the question is going to be, do we actually have the capacity and the desire to kind of do the work that takes? But I think it's going to force people to sort of go into places and spaces that are right now being labeled uncomfortable, and that I think there's been maybe a little bit too much permission to say, well, just, that's not us and they're other. And that's coming from people who, I may respect their values and I may respect the values they stand for in theory, and the ways in which they're bringing them out into the world feel very either or and very kind of like extreme, very left hemispheric. Even though the values are different, as opposed to people who are sitting in the middle and sort of understand like life is gray, and people have all kinds of competing contradictory pieces to their nature. It's far better to make room for that, because otherwise there might not be room for us either, like at the end of it, if we're looking for perfection
Yeah.
and consistency. So yeah.
Do you hold out hope for that we will develop that capacity and like answering your own question? How do you think about answering your own question?
Yeah. So I'm a futurist, and that's a question people ask. They're like, so what do you predict? And my answer is always, there's no way to predict, because we're a dynamic ecosystem made up of individuals. And so a large part of it is going to be choices, and the choices people make. And I would say that I certainly feel like I'm shifting my work and how I spend my time to try to give talks, to do workshops, to help people kind of break free of their own thinking sometimes, and to sort of like build the skills they need to navigate a VUCA world. I'm working on a second book project that kind of talks about some of these skills that I think I and others develop often because of our growing up across cultures and contexts, and so had to develop those skills early. And I think those skills are very consistent with that right hemispheric piece. So yes, I mean, yes, always, right? Because the possibility is there. I think whether it happens or not is very much going to be a choice. And I think, unfortunately, there's kind of a narrative happening right now where people are kind of going, oh God, this is too much. I'm going to disconnect. No, I can't pay attention to the news. I can't take this all on. And there's a visual that I like. It's kind of three circles, some concentric circles, with the smallest one being your sphere of control, the second one being your sphere of influence, and your third being your sphere of concern. So like our sphere of concern is to have a world in which people actually get along and our children will live and have a climate and an earth that can actually sustain them, right? There's a whole where there's not income disparities, right, in ways that we have. There's all these kinds of things that we want on that sphere of concern. And the problem is when you focus on your sphere of concern overly, it feels really big because it is. And it feels impossible to get to because it is, because you're just one individual. But your sphere of control is like the place to sit because we control two things. We control what we do and we control how we react when something happens to us. And those are the only two things we control. We don't control other people. We don't control our kids. We don't control like anything. We don't even control what happens to us. Yeah. But if you develop different muscles so that you can make different choices in your sphere of concern, then actually it shifts what happens in your sphere of influence. That if you choose to ask, like, tell me more about that when someone says something that you like, or, like, I'm curious, why you think that, or, here's why I think what I think, and I'm curious what you think. If you do that instead of being like, yep, done, I'm walking away, that changes what happens. And when something different happens in your sphere of influence in a dynamic system, it makes different things possible in your sphere of concern, right? And so even though it feels like it's a small thing to like choose to have a different conversation with somebody at that cocktail party, or, like talk to your uncle who watches Fox News, or sorry, I just gave my politics away, but
we can cut that
shocking.
out.
No.
Yeah.
Talk to your relative who like watches a different media than you do, right? If it feels like that doesn't make a big deal. You're like, well, what does it do? And you're like, it does actually do something, because we live in systems where like we push against other people in small ways, and then they push on other things in different ways, and it ripples out, and we can't know exactly what happens. And so yeah, it's a large part of what I'm doing now is kind of thinking and talking and speaking a lot about that, like how do we show up differently, right? And I keep talking about showing up differently in the work and in a space. And to me, that's like the thing I feel like I can do and control. But yes, hope springs eternal.
I love it. One of my mentors used to say, inch by inch, life's a cinch. Yard by yard, life is hard.
Mm.
And what he was talking about, he had this other saying, make each day your masterpiece. John Wooden, UCLA basketball coach. And so he was talking about that circle, that locus of control, and focus on this practice this day and do the best you can with this. Don't worry about the bigger game or the season or, those things, right? So the second thing that you talked about, and you've talked about throughout, is you strike me as a very curious person. Like someone who activates, and I love that. You smile too, right? Like it's a great compliment because you activate that curiosity. I don't look at it as a noun. I look at it as a verb. It's something you do. So by doing that, like saying, oh, okay, well, I see it from another perspective. Like, tell me more about yours. It's an opening for a conversation versus a shutting down and a closing of a door and removing somebody from a house and, and like a town and all this, right? Like, so kudos to you for cultivating that garden of curiosity.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I love that description, right? Because I think stories matter. And so often, like, we judge people based on a thing we see, but that thing sits inside of a larger story, and you don't know what that story is. And you still may not agree with where they come from at the end of that story, but you have a better sense of where it is that they're coming from and why actually they might have raised something where you're like, yeah, I can see that's really complicated, or I can see why. I still don't agree that the right policy is there, but it gives a very different space in which to play or look for solutions than to kind of come in with like, this is what I think, and if you don't think that, that's it. Because there's no room for finding anything. And I think the most complicated, thorny problems, which are the ones that we're all, at this point, many of us are trying to grapple with, they are not easy. because there are many conflicting values at play. And so the right policy, there is no one right policy. Right is going to be a combination of the balancing of those competing priorities for very particular reasons, and hopefully along the way being clear which values you're not upholding as much in the decision so that you can potentially mitigate those. But if you're not even aware of what the competing values are, then you're not going to pay attention to them. And I think like we've seen some of this, in Spain, we had that blackout. There was that blackout in Spain and Portugal and part of France. And I was listening to a talk at this conference I was at around, how it was about baseload, where you have always need. Even if you've got renewables, you need a foundation of load that is being created, usually through natural gas or coal or nuclear or something that is not intermittent. Because at any point, the renewables can kind of like not quite work the way you need. And when that happens, one thing happens like dominoes and the whole grid goes out of play. And that's what happened in Spain. So like even here, as we think about renewables and the push to renewables, there are many people who are like fundamentalist about this. And they're like, absolutely no gas or nuclear or coal or whatever, 100% renewable. Like, first of all, that is not possible in terms of engineering right now. We don't have the batteries, we don't have whatever. So even if you wanted to, you couldn't do that. So to push for something that isn't realistic without being open to like, look, the issue is it's technical, it's this. Yes, of course, there are financial interests and there are interest groups and blah, blah, blah. But the solution space exists, but you have to be willing to like have the conversation inside the solution space. And often activists and advocates sit in these like extreme positions where they're sort of so committed that they're not willing or able to kind of play in the middle. But the complicated things we want to do are going to have solutions that sit somewhere in this big gray space.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of you make me think of Abraham Lincoln with his team of rivals, where he surrounded himself with all these competing viewpoints, so that way he could get a better understanding of how to move forward versus like, well, this is how I think I'm gonna, and that's just what we're doing. I'm in charge, and that's the way it is, right?
Yeah.
But with the team of rivals, it was like also a lot of his ideas were stress tested.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is a lot more valuable because sometimes you might have a good idea, but it's not a great idea without that stress test.
Right. Or hopefully the stress test has you tweaking it, right, in certain places to kind of account for and be stronger. And that takes it takes a level of like confidence and just kind of assuredness, not that you're right, but an assuredness that just because you might not be right or that you might be wrong doesn't somehow diminish you as a person.
Yes.
And as a human being, right? And yet, again, like we're living in a culture right now where so much of people's image and sense of self is defined by their external image and this like presentation of a polished, whole, right? Vulnerability, authenticity, those are not things that are really rewarded in a lot of the spaces and social media and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, we're going to need to rebuild those muscles.
Yes.
Of states personhood, right?
Exactly. Personhood. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
All right, so we're coming up on time. I want to be respectful of your time. 2 questions for you, part A, part B. Is one, closing thoughts, and then secondly, while you're thinking of that, is where can people find your work? I mentioned your TED Talks, your book, follow you, anywhere you want to go and those.
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of like a recreation of stuff. So I do have a website. It's www.ulcca, my first name, ulcca.com. And there are links to some of my work. But that site right now is very educationally focused. It doesn't reflect sort of the newer work that I'm doing just around some of the stuff we've been talking about today. But yes, my TED Talks, what I can do is I can send you a few articles to put in the show notes. Do you have show notes?
I'm going to have to see.
Okay. But the nice thing about a name like Ulcca is if you put it into Google and you put Ulcca and articles, you will get like lists of some of the stuff that I've published more recently in the Fulcrum and Visible Magazine, WashPo, around different topics. But yes, my website is probably the easiest. And then on LinkedIn, I'm /Ulcca. Once again, the nice thing about having a name that I've never met anybody who has my name. So yeah. Yeah, back in the day when I started on Twitter, I was very lucky. I got @Ulcca. And it turned out there was an Ulcca 2. And I was like, who is Ulcca 2? It turned out it was the University of Leicester Conservative Christian Association. So I was like, I'm really glad that I got Ulcca first. And hopefully nobody thinks that Ulcca 2 is like the second version of my personality.
Yes. And what's the origin of your first name?
It's a Sanskrit word. So my family's Indian by origin. My family's 3 generations Tanzanian. But yes, it's a Sanskrit word. And it means, it's sort of the name of an angel in Indian mythology, but it also means like a bright light in the sky, like a shooting star or a comet or a meteor. Or as I became during my dad's wedding toast, a self-guided missile. Which I was like, really, Dad? So destructive. So destructive. No, he started with Khalil Gibran's The Arrow, which I love. It's the poem that starts my book. But yeah, somehow in the journey. Yeah. I think that says something about how my parents felt. Like, holy crap, we tried. But we couldn't direct. We couldn't direct.
Yeah, she just went off.
She went. Married a white boy. What's she gonna do?
Kansas.
From Kansas to Nebraska. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. All right, well, we'll stop there. Thank you so much.
You didn't let me do any closing thoughts, Chad. No, I don't have any closing thoughts.
Yeah, closing thoughts.
I've been giving you all my thoughts. I mean, unless you want to go on for another hour.
Yeah.
No,
I'm game, but yeah.
Listen to Chad's show, send it to lots of people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you liked it, please share with a friend on social media. That goes a long way to promoting this podcast so I can continue to interview and share these conversations with fascinating people. You can follow me on social media, Chad Stoloff, and visit my website, chadstoloff.wordpress.com, for more information. I'd love it if you would leave a review to support the podcast. Thanks so much. Until next time.